Welcome to the Silver Screen Guide podcast, where we discuss films from every genre. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the podcast.
Today we are discussing the Maltese Falcon, the 1941 Humphrey Bogart version. And this, listeners, is the first installment in our Humphrey Bogart Retrospective series. It's fall. We're kind of moving into a time of staying inside, kind of hibernating. You want to curl up with a nice classic. At least that's what I think of around this time. There's a lot of classic movies that, especially a lot of classic Christmas movies or kind of Thanksgiving-esque movies, and we'll be reviewing some of those for certain specials that we have lined up. But I think this is kind of a nice introduction to the season. The summer blockbuster time is over. Now it is time to talk about some classics here on the show, and I'm really excited to talk about them.
I am too, and this, I know I've seen a few Humphrey Bogart. The one that I remember seeing firstly in like the more film noir kind of style would have been The Big Sleep, I believe. Yes, that was A Big Sleep, and then not long after that, I know that we watched Casablanca together. Yes. But definitely The Big Sleep was one of the first film noir movies that I'd watched with Bogart in it. I remember really liking that one, and I was really excited because I know you talked up the Maltese Falcon for a while, and I was just like, I guess I'll check it out, but never got around to it until now when we put it on the schedule. So I was really excited to get into this one because I had heard so many good things about it, but I never really sat down to watch it, probably because I never really had a chance, or I guess a platform to watch it on until now. So.
Yes, this is done by John Huston, directed and written by John Huston. You'll notice that John Huston and Bogart work together on a number of movies. We'll be talking about that in, I know at least one of the upcoming reviews. I guess we'll find out if he has in the others. But this movie is based upon the novel by Dashiell Hammet, which was written in the 1930s. It was actually serialized, which means it came out in 5 parts in a magazine called The Black Mask. And interestingly enough, Hammet drew from his own detective experience. He was a detective for a few years, and just the people he encountered and whatnot, he brought that to this novel that he wrote. Before we go too far, I also noticed it was interesting in the opening credits, there is a dialogue director.
Interesting. I mean, I'm sure that one of those probably exists just in movies in general. I just had never really heard of such a title, I guess. Yeah,
it was pretty actually high up on the billing, in the opening billing for the movie. Robert Falk, I think is how you pronounce his name.
Okay.
He's the dialogue director, and that makes sense because this movie is very dialogue heavy.
Oh, yes. It is very dialogue heavy.
Well, my experience with Humphrey Bogart films, I've seen quite a few of them, a lot of them actually over the years, but Bogart's oeuvre of work is so extensive, I have clearly not seen all of them just yet. I would like to someday, but I do remember this was one of the first Humphrey Bogart movies I ever saw. It was probably the first one, actually. My dad introduced it to me, and I've seen it multiple times since then, but this movie is so thick, it's hard to have a lot of the plot details just cement in your memory due to all the twists and turns of the characters.
Right. In my own experience, I mean, I guess I kind of already talked about it. I have heard of it, but up until now, I had never watched it. And now that we are finally talking about it, I did get to finally watch it. And so, yeah, you're very right. A lot of these plot details, the dialogue's very dense. And there's a good reason for that, and we'll definitely get into that in the review. But that is something that I found to be very interesting, is that usually people tend to think that an older movie is boring and rather slow. I would say there are many exceptions to that thought, and this is probably one of those.
Yeah, it seems like most people that think older movies are boring and slow or black and white automatically makes it boring. I believe those people are mostly just used to the modern day visual effects extravaganza, which usually replaces good writing. Now, not always the case, but more times than not, it seems like today's cinema is more so focused on the visual effects and less on the actors and their dialogue.
Right. That's very, very true.
And because if you think about it, the cinema is an evolution or kind of an outgrowth in certain ways, or a spin-off, you might say, of the stage play, where it was pretty much all dialogue driven. There might have been some kind of effects, but they weren't too prominent or too big. And so actors had to be pretty keen about their dialogue and their deliveries and just their acting in general, because in a play, you can't just cut to different scenes. I know, for instance, the original classic with Marlon Brando, Streetcar Named Desire, they all played those characters on the stage on Broadway, and then they were all cast in the movie, which is interesting.
Right. And that's kind of the thing when it comes to just films in general, is when they first began, they didn't really ever know what a cut was until, I think it was A Trip to the Moon. That was one that really popularized the cut. Because, like you said, you can't do that in a stage play. And so when A Trip to the Moon came out and showed that you can have that juxtaposition when you cut from one shot to the next shot and have it still be in the same scene, was very innovative. Because you could track, your brain could figure out and track that, okay, because even though we cut and things have changed from this and that, we do know that they are still in the same scene, and the same thing is still happening, just from a different angle. And so since then, of course, that was back in early 1900s, I think. And since then, of course, film has evolved. And around this time when the Maltese Falcon came out, I think it was around, I want to say about 35-ish to around the late 60s was considered to be the golden age of cinema. And that's when a lot of the innovations that we see now kind of came into play, and cinema really introduced and grounded its role in society with a lot of these movies. And most of them are pretty much dramas, but there's a good reason for that. And since then, of course, we've evolved, as you said. But yeah, from the history until now, this movie's kind of snack dab right in the middle-ish of the golden age.
Right, and this is even in its own subgenre of film noir, which is mostly considered about detective stories. Now, not necessarily. There are some exceptions to that. But overall, yes, film noir consists of detective narratives. And this didn't necessarily have to be in black and white. Gone with the Wind came out in 1939 and won Best Picture of the Year along with every other Oscar, and it was in color. But having these kind of film noir films be in black and white has definitely become iconic. They weren't trying to make it that way back then, but now when you think of noir, it's always black and white, is your thought.
Right. And with this movie, too, from what I understand, it was more or less the birth of film noir. From here, I think for the next about 15 years or so was the big time for film noir movies to be coming out. Yeah, and this is, absolutely, from what I understand, was one of the ones that either began it or was the birth of this genre, or I guess this subgenre.
That probably would make sense. And this wasn't the first adaptation of the Maltese Falcon. The very first adaptation was in 1931. This was actually kind of before any sort of movie ratings or code was produced. More so put into the rules for how films could be shown or even what they could show. And we talked about all of that quite a while ago now on our MPAA discussion podcast. So if you want to know more about that, go check out that podcast. And I haven't seen any other version of this movie. I honestly didn't really know there was all these other versions until I did some research for this. But the 31 version is interesting because it was apparently featured lewd content. Now, I don't believe there was any nudity, but there was a lot of talk of homosexuality and just doing certain sexual situations that were just deemed not appropriate for audiences at the time. Now, in today's world, yeah, this would be probably fairly tame, all of it, but back then it was considered very lewd and risque, and because Warner Brothers wanted to re-release the 31 version, They said no way. But the 31 version with that kind of content is closer to the book. Now, the plot of this movie is pretty much the same plot of the book. Very similar, but they just kind of left out some of those sexual situations. Although I will say Bogart's character is a bit of an opportunist when he kisses women in this movie.
That's just also kind of a trope for Bogart in general, really. But
he's a ladies' man.
Yeah, he really is. And I mean, I wouldn't blame him because he's a good-looking man, has a great voice.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah. And I know that there were even some scenes in this that they had decided to throw out because they knew that the Hays Code wouldn't necessarily agree with this as it did with the 31 version. Kind of the same thing. Yes, of course, at this time, there really was no rating system. The MPAA hadn't been established yet, I don't think. That came a few years later after this. But yeah, Hays' Code was in full effect at this point. It was essentially a yes or no when it came to movies. Either yes, you can show it, or no, you can't. This is not socially, morally correct in their eyes. Of course, things are much, much different now because we have many different ratings for movies. But back then, it was essentially just a yes or no. It was black and white.
And even after the 31 version, there was a 36 version. It was a bit of a comedic adaptation called Satan Met a Lady, starring Bette Davis and Warren William. It apparently received poor reviews, and Davis herself referred to the film as junk. And then, of course, in 1941, the Maltese Falcon, the one we are reviewing today, it is the best-known version. It's a classic. We will talk about some of its kind of accolades and how it is remembered today here in just a minute. And then apparently in 1975, there was this spoof sequel called The Black Bird. I have not heard of any of these movies before. I haven't seen them.
I know I've heard of at least the 31 version, but past that, I haven't really heard of much.
And in 2008, apparently there was a stage play called The Maltese Murder. I didn't know about that either.
Interesting.
It's interesting because it says it's a playwright by Brian Cawley, commissioned by the Johnson County Library in Kansas as part of the National Endowment for the Arts Big Read.
Interesting.
Well,
I do know that the Maltese Falcon, the 1941 version, was in talks at one point to have a sequel, and then for one reason or another, that also fell through. But that would have been interesting to have a sequel to this movie, especially.
Yeah, this film was very successful at the time, so Warner Brothers said, let's make a sequel. Supposedly, it would have been titled The Further Adventures of the Maltese Falcon. Not a very good title, but that title was like super common back then, where it was like The Continuing Adventures of Lassie. Houston, they wanted Houston to come back and direct. This was early in 1942, just like I said, immediately after this one came out. But Houston was in high demand as a director. He was a very famous director, nominated a few times for certain Academy Awards, and the rest of the cast was essentially unavailable as well. Bogart had other films to make, so that just fell through, and I doubt Warner Brothers would pull a Blade Runner 2049 and make a sequel. I don't know. Maybe I should never say never. Maybe we could be getting a sequel to the Maltese Falcon someday.
Right. I mean, it is interesting, too, how we have so many sequels coming out, but they're all more or less from the 70s and on. That's where you get most of the sequels and remakes is from that era. Yes. Occasionally you get something from the older times, but for the most part, that golden age usually, from what I have seen, isn't touched very often, probably for really good reason, because that would set off a lot of people if they did just one thing wrong. Especially for a lot of cinephiles. So I think that might be the reason why they haven't exactly done much with the Maltese Falcon since then, except for maybe a stage play. But it would be interesting to see if they were to do something with the Maltese Falcon in a more modern age.
That would be interesting. You bring up a good point, though, that the sequels, prequels, and remakes weren't a thing, really, until much later in the century. Mostly everything produced was either adapted from like books, which was fairly common, or it was just an original idea, just like this movie was adapted from a book. And yeah, there have been sequels or remakes of movies around this time period, but they've usually been direct to TV on a very low budget that nobody remembers or ever really watched.
Right. I know It's a Wonderful Life is a big example where it kind of fell into public domain for a whole while.
Oh,
and there was one remake that we didn't think we talked about that was very, very similar. Basically a copy, except for one small change of the character being a woman and having a different name as the main character. Other than that, everything was basically the same. But of course, that was when it was in the public domain. So yeah, you never really see that much. I mean, yeah, there are sequels to things like Fast and the Furious. I know I had a few sequels back in the day. But usually things are pretty standalone.
You're talking about the old Fast and the Furious, right?
Yes, the very old Fast and the Furious, not the new ones.
Okay,
although those are more remakes, I guess, of the old ones.
Right, okay. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
This movie, from what I could find, had a budget of just $3,700.
To be fair, this is back in the 1940s, so I really do wonder what that is in today's money with inflation.
Yeah, usually you don't pay attention too much to budgets and box office at the time because we're so far removed from this time period, so it just doesn't really make sense, how far of the distribution it had anyway. It did supposedly gross around 1.7 million. I've heard reports that are a little lower. Nevertheless, it was a success.
Yeah, that is, even in that time, 1.1 million on a about $3,000 budget is really, really good. Even in today's world, that would still be very good. And I know that John Huston, the director, was very thorough with a lot of things. One of those also being not only just the script and the shootings and the shooting, but also in terms of budget. I know that this was kind of on a smaller budget, but he kept things very contained and kept things more or less under control. Never went over budget, and even at the end of all shooting, they had extra time to just kind of hang out because they had followed the schedule and they ended up moving ahead of schedule. So from what I understand, John Huston was very involved with a lot of things in this movie and kept heavy reign over those. And so that, once again, I think he even said that there weren't really any lines taken out of the final script. There was maybe a couple of shots of things, but for the most part, everything that was made was in the final release.
You're right, and that doesn't surprise me at all. John Huston is known for, making great movies, and I think just being a great director in general. People have enjoyed working with him. And it paid off at the Academy Awards. This film was nominated for Best Picture of the Year. Sidney Greenstreet was nominated for Best Supporting Actor. I could definitely see that. And this was also nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay. And like I said, from what I understand, it's very faithful adaptation to the novel. And today it holds at 8.1 on IMDb. Great rating. That is a great endorsement. And it is the IMDb's top-rated 221st film.
I mean, that is pretty low on that top 250 list, but it's still up there.
Yes.
So that says something.
Well, listeners, we are about to get into the plot of The Maltese Falcon. If you don't want it spoiled for you, which I recommend that you don't get it spoiled for you, this is a great movie to experience with all the twists. Go ahead and hit pause right now. Go ahead and rent it or buy it. Come back and click play and we'll be ready to talk about it. Samuel Spade, played by Humphrey Bogart, and Miles Archer, played by Jerome Cohen, have their own private detective agency in San Francisco. One day, a woman named Miss Wonderly, played by Mary Astor, visits their office. She asks for their help tailing a man named Floyd Thursby, who we actually never see. Thursby and her younger sister ran off together, and she's there to find her younger sister. Archer agrees to the job, but is shot that night by an unknown person. At the crime scene, Sam encounters two police detectives. One is friendly with Sam, the other isn't so much. They tell Sam that Thursby was also shot that night, but Thursby's guns don't match the caliber of bullets Miles was shot with. At Wonderly's apartment, he breaks the news to her, but Sam figures out she was lying about the sister narrative, and her name isn't actually Wonderly, it's O'Shaughnessy. She explains she met Thursby in the Orient and came with him here from Hong Kong. Later, a man named Joel Cairo, played by Peter Lorre, comes to Sam's office where he offers him $5,000 for the recovery of a blackbird statuette. But he believes Sam is hiding the bird in his office, so he pulls a gun on him to search around, which fails to work since Sam knocks him out and takes his gun. Well, come to find out, O'Shaughnessy and Cairo know each other. Both were of the same party from Hong Kong. O'Shaughnessy knows where Thursby hid the Falcon, at least that's what she claims. Later on, Sam is followed by a young man named Wilbur, played by Elisha Cook Jr., who works for Mr. Gutman, played by Sidney Greenstreet, and he is actually working with Cairo, we come to find out, and I'll get into it in just a second. So Greenstreet is offering a great deal of money for its recovery. Gutman explains in 1539, the Knights Templars of Malta paid tribute to Charles V of Spain by sending him a golden falcon encrusted from the beak to the claw with rarest jewels. But pirates seized the galley carrying this priceless token, and the fate of the Maltese Falcon remains a mystery to this day. But before Sam and Gutman can negotiate anymore, come to find out Sam is actually been drugged. And Cairo comes into the hotel apartment, and Gutman, Cairo, and Wilbur head to the La Paloma ship arriving from Hong Kong. When Sam awakens, he goes to the La Paloma to find the ship on fire. Back at his office, Captain Jack of the La Paloma is near death due to severe gunshot wounds. He delivers the Falcon to Sam, who then receives a phone call from O'Shaughnessy declaring she's in trouble and to find her at an address. So once Sam gets there, he finds only a vacant lot and realizes he's being played. See, O'Shaughnessy got to Captain Jack to tell him to deliver the Falcon to Sam's office, but then she was convinced by Gutman's crew to lie to Sam to get him away from his office so they could go and search for the Falcon. But back at his apartment, he finds Gutman's crew and O'Shaughnessy there, and he declares after he is richly rewarded, he'll deliver the Falcon to them. So Gutman gives him $10,000, and Sam has his secretary, Effie, deliver the Falcon to the apartment. Gutman rips open the package, only to discover the Falcon is actually a fake. The group sets off for Istanbul, where they believe the next clue to the Falcon may lie. Sam tips off the police detectives, he tips off the police detectives as to Gutman and Wilbur and Cairo. But one last mystery must be solved. Who shot his partner, Miles Archer? The only person it could have been was O'Shaughnessy. She's so upset about it all and declares her love for Sam, hoping that'll be enough for him not to turn her in. Nevertheless, the seemingly kind of crooked opportunist Sam Spade decides to do the right thing by handing her over to the police detectives along with the evidence. When Sam hands over the fake Falcon, explaining it to be the cause of all the trouble, they ask, "What is it?" Sam explains, "The stuff dreams are made of," as credits roll. So as you can tell, listeners, this is a fairly thick plot, and that's not even the full plot. There was a side plot that I kind of left out in order to just keep focused on the main plot of this movie, and that side plot is Sam is having an affair with Archer's wife, and she mostly just pops up to kind of be a nuisance. She sets the police detectives on him at least once because she was mad with jealousy, apparently. So we'll get into whether Alan and I think that that kind of side plot works, because it kind of pops up a number of times until it's just eventually dissolved altogether and we just are left to focus. There's also a bit of a side plot where Sam has to talk with like the district attorney or something about him getting in trouble. It can get a little convoluted, but that's why with this plot I kind of try to just stick with the basics of what is this movie going for.
Right, and that kind of gets into the biggest thing about this movie. It is a very confusing movie on the surface. And there's a good reason for that. One of the main themes of this whole movie is lying, more or less. Every character that is suspicious is lying through their teeth at some point in the movie, to a certain extent, I guess. But then, like, a big example is with Miss Wonderly or Miss O'Shaughnessy. She more or less just doesn't ever tell the truth throughout the entire movie up until the very, very end, when she finally says the truth. But even then, it's after Humphrey Bogart's character kind of already had figured it out. And then you have characters like Mr. Gutman, who may be telling the truth the whole time, but purposefully leaves out certain elements of his story just to get what he wants. It's very, very interesting, this world take on lying, and then you've also got themes of loyalty and greed and things like that, because in this world, the truth is rather priceless. I think that's most evident through Gutman himself, because he lives a very expensive lifestyle, and the lie that you may come to believe may be, I guess, fruitful at the time, but when you look underneath it, it's basically worthless, evident with the Maltese Falcon itself.
Yes, this movie very much could have been called State of Play, which is a movie with Russell Crowe and Ben Affleck. I enjoy that movie. It's very good. But this movie, everyone is always playing each other.
Right.
Almost everyone, I guess I should say. Probably Effie is not playing, but even she knows things going on behind the scenes that she's not going to maybe fess up to. She kind of, I was under the impression she knew that Sam and maybe Archer's wife were kind of seeing each other.
Yeah, okay. Now, this is a plot point that I guess I was very confused on, because at what points in the movie did Archer's wife show up? Because I always thought that was O'Shaughnessy that was there.
Oh, no. Archer's wife was always dressed in black, and she always had that black veil pulled back over her head.
Oh, okay. I understand now.
Yes.
I thought, see, for whatever reason, I always thought that was Miss O'Shaughnessy. I guess that clears up a couple of things for me.
Oh, yeah. No, that was always Archer's wife. Her name is Iva, I believe.
Okay.
So basically what happened is, well, it's interesting because we can start from the beginning here. This movie essentially begins, the whole premise begins with a lie.
Yes.
So Miss Wonderly, not her name, she makes up this story about how she came from New York to find her younger sister, Corinne, and she's run off with this man named Thursby, and Thursby has a wife and 3 children, and she's afraid Thursby would resort to murder to keep Corinne away from her. And so I'm taking notes on all of this. I'm like, ooh, okay, this is important. Come to find out, none of it's true.
Right. Well, that's the interesting part about it, is the only true thing about this is Thurnsby being the one who is not necessarily on the same team as our main as Ms. Wonderly or Miss O'Shaughnessy, as we come to find out. Essentially, we come to find out later, after a long time of kind of gathering and tricking your way through these lies, that she was scared that Thurnsby was going to kill her. And he was going to turn his back on this whole operation. And so she wanted him to get nabbed first, while she could go after the Maltese Falcon herself. That was the real truth. But what she was telling us is that her sister just ran off with some guy, and she just wants to know where she's at, and hopefully find her sister, and all kinds of stuff like that. That was the main thing. The sister, the parents, the basic plot that she gives for this problem that she has is all a lie. It's not all true. The only true part about it is that Thurnsby exists, really.
Yes. And I think it's a good hook. All of this is, you're kind of wondering how in the world, because the movie actually opens with a text crawl about the history of the Maltese Falcon, and you're thinking, how in the world is this going to connect with this Wonderly lady and these 2 detectives in San Francisco, 400 years after this Maltese Falcon disappeared. And I will say, I do like the characters of Sam Spade and Archer here in the beginning. They kind of, just their facial expressions are kind of funny, how Wonderly is pulling out money, and they kind of give each other this look and give her this look like, is that all you're going to pay us? So she pulls out a bunch more, but we come to find out she's overpaying them. Right.
And that was the thing that set off Spade in the beginning to be suspicious of her.
Right.
Was that she overpaid them.
Yes, and I thought, you know what? Being a detective looks like fun. You get to solve mysteries, you get to find people, you get to kind of you get overpaid all the time. It seems like lots of money.
Right.
Kind of made me think of the Rockstar game LA Noir. Captures this very well, I would say, kind of solving these mysteries. Now, this movie isn't more so about solving kind of more of a mainstream mystery in that sense. It's more about these people. I would say it's very similar to, in a way, it's a mad, mad, mad world.
Yeah, that's very, very true, because in both those movies, they're all kind of going after the central thing. Now, of course, a mad, 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 mad world is more of a comedy than this one is, but they have very similar takes on greed and having everyone go after this one thing. But with that being said, this movie is a bit more central, a bit more closed-minded than Mad, 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 Mad World, because they have two different styles.
Oh, yes, very different. My connection between the two was we have a lot of different characters that are all connected in a certain way. They're essentially going after a MacGuffin, and how they get to that and how they kind of all end up together. Now, clearly, the actual circumstances are different, but just that central idea. If you know that movie, if you keep that in mind, that'll probably kind of help you, give you some kind of base for how these characters are introduced. And the Falcon is essentially the main plot device. It's the MacGuffin that they're searching for.
Right. It absolutely is. And that's the one thing I actually really thought was interesting about this movie is the Falcon. It wasn't very long into this movie where I was like, okay, there's no way that this Falcon is real. And because of that, I mean, they're going after this one thing as they don't even know all about it. The only thing that they know is that underneath it, if it is real, it's going to be gold. But the problem with that, or gold, jewels, and all kinds of stuff. But the problem with that I had was, but everything else in this movie has already been a lie up to this point. I forget exactly what part of the movie I was in when I typed this up. And so that was what led me to believe that the Falcon isn't real. Now, we do find out that the Falcon, in fact, is not real, but that's also kind of not necessarily the whole point, that the Falcon isn't real. The whole point is that the Falcon isn't real. The Falcon's a complete phony. The problem is that everyone believes it was real, and they went after a false truth, and that kind of got them in the hot water. They did all of this for a hunk of lead.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because when you think about it, a number of people were murdered and many going to jail essentially for nothing. Right. The greed, the drive for greed was a lot of people's extreme downfalls, a lot of lives ruined over that. So in many ways, this movie is a cautionary tale of when you strive for something too much. And we've seen this in other movies before, notably the ones I'm thinking of are some of the Indiana Jones movies.
Right. Yeah, that's a more modern example too.
Right. Of
greed overcoming, or greed over kind of overtaking your own thoughts.
Yes. Yeah. Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. They're searching for the Sorcerer's Stone. These people want it, but whoever's more so, the more pure of heart of those will succeed, and their lives won't be messed up, essentially. Right. So, and this movie, you definitely have to pay attention. I recommend subtitles because they talk very quickly.
They absolutely do. This is a very dialogue-heavy movie, to a point where, especially there in like the final scene, it gets extremely confusing because there are so many things that you don't know if they're true or if they're not true, and they might be true, but how is that connected to the whole story? If it is true, it's very muddy. And once again, that's the point of the whole movie. This whole movie is kind of muddy, just begin with up until the very end. And that's the whole point. You're kind of watching this lie unfold, and that's kind of more or less done through Bogart's character as he wades through all these different stories to find the absolute truth between all of them. Usually, in a police detective, you'll find different suspects or different people who were there who had witnessed the event. Now, they all may have very vastly different stories, but somewhere in there's a through line that connects them all. We never necessarily get that until the very end of this movie when he kind of figures it all out, which I thought was very interesting, how it purposefully made its story muddy to get its point across. Usually that would come out as a criticism, but this time they do it deliberately because that's how it needs to be told in the context of the movie.
And I would say if you didn't have these leads, then it wouldn't be as good as it is.
Oh yeah, absolutely not.
And I think the characters, Bogart's character Spade and O'Shaughnessy, are very complex characters. Mm-hmm. At the very end of the movie is when it's kind of the moment of truth for everybody. what kind of person are they going to become? We've seen each of them make either questionable choices or immoral choices, and then you wonder, well, okay, how are they going to end up? And with Spade, O'Shaughnessy says to Spade, you really wouldn't turn me in, or you really wouldn't do this to me, would you? And he said, oh, don't be so sure. I'm only as corrupt as I need to be.
Right.
So that's something along those lines. And I was like, wow, that's a really interesting way of saying it. And, she's the same way as well, because she kind of portrays herself as this victim, but in fact, she is like this master manipulator. And I think she has a great complex character here of always pulling the strings, always manipulating people. I mean, she's like what is it called? A sociological liar, something like that. Pathological liar.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing I really like about her character, is that she just kind of digs herself into the situation and then continues to dig to try and get herself out of the situation. And then, of course, by that point, it's too late. She ends up becoming the fall guy in the end, because she dug herself essentially into her own grave. She was the one who didn't want to tell the truth of the situation to anybody, not even Bogart's character, named Spade. And doing that, and even though he called her out many times that you're not being truthful with me, you're not giving me the whole thing, why not just tell me and get this all over with? Instead, she wants it all for herself, and so she digs herself farther and farther and farther until she just can't escape it all, and she goes to jail for everything that everybody else really did. She becomes the fall guy at the very end, which is what I found to be very interesting, because you get to see her character slowly kind of devolve, even though she offers Spade more or less sex. She offers him herself towards him, hoping that would pay him off, because she knows that she doesn't have enough money to do that. He kind of takes it, and it kind of becomes a temptation for him as the movie goes along. But at the end of the day, it's kind of, I guess, a Casablanca kind of a thing. It's honor over love. He has to turn her in because that's the right and truthful thing to do. Even though he says, I could, as immorally, I guess, could just take you and not have anybody be told, and the whole thing would be over. But that's not the truthful thing to do. It's not the right thing to do here. And then he turns her in. And even though, once again, she becomes the fall guy for all this, even though it may not all be her fault, the fact that she dug her own grave, got herself into the situation, now it lands her in jail for 20 years at the least, or a life at max.
Right. And that's something important to note is movies of this time period, pretty much all up until the modern era, usually there was, it was either a cautionary tale, there was a moral to the story, where even though this character has exhibited questionable ethics, they nevertheless would ultimately do the right thing in the end. They would still be a stand-up guy or whatever. Only until the modern era has really, it seems like anyway, I'm sure there's a few exceptions, but has... do we have these heroes or anti-heroes that make bad choices and then ultimately they get away with those bad choices, and then we're supposed to root for them? Sam could have gotten away with all kinds of stuff and been rich and gone off, and we could have, rooted for him. Kind of like in the Ocean's movies, they rob banks or it's a casino, I guess, and banks. And then they get away with it, and we're supposed to cheer that they can get away with crime, essentially. Whereas this is the exact opposite. It's showing, wait a minute, he's going to do the right thing in the end. That's interesting to note kind of how those ethics have changed in movies.
Right. And it's even also more interesting to the fact that we get to see how he was tempted towards one side or the other, because with Gutman, he essentially offered him cash. He offered him upwards of about $1 million at one point, right. He says, is how much the bird is worth, relatively speaking. And then you've also got on the other side, you got O'Shaughnessy, who's giving him herself, both sides so they can help. Both sides, they do this so that he can help them to get what they want. They're more or less bribing him to do things that they want, to take a part of this lie, essentially, and get them this thing that is very, very expensive. And then we kind of come to find out that Gutman wasn't exactly correct, or I guess not exactly telling all the truth when it came to him bribing him, because he said about $25,000, only gave him about $10,000. And in the end, Gutman walks away with it, only giving him maybe a couple $100 from the stash. And then you've also, of course, we talked about Chauncey here just a second ago, where she offers him everything, but he's the one who picks it apart and says, I can't. There's no way I can do this and get away with it and be okay with it, It's very, very interesting how much he's bribed on both sides. How you could have all the money in the world, or you could have a beautiful woman in the end. But once again, what would be the point?
Right. The point would be essentially fruitless because just as the Falcon didn't pay off, well, none of this other stuff is going to pay off as well. He is kind of constantly berated by two of these detectives, at least one of them throughout the movie, who really want to set him up as the fall guy for his partner's murder and Thursby's murder as well. And so he kind of has to also think about his name to clear. And towards the end, he's saying, I'm in pretty deep with this. So that's a brief point towards the latter half of the movie where he thinks, I'm in so deep with this, they could easily, finger me for all of this crime. So then that kind of sets up the seeds where he seems to be kind of plotting with them. But in the end, he's kind of thinking this whole time, I'm going to eventually set them up because it's just not going to pay off.
Right. And I would say that I kind of want to talk about Gutman here just a sec, because I found his character to also be very, very interesting. Because I think I mentioned this earlier, his character is more of the idea that the truth is very priceless. And I don't think there was ever a moment where he isn't necessarily telling the truth or isn't necessarily lying, but more to the fact that he just isn't telling the whole truth. He's only giving pieces of the information. One good example of this is when Spade first visits Gutman, and they talk about how he wants this information from a bird. What is the bird? Why are you going after it? And Gutman kind of dances around this. And even though he says, if you be honest with me, I'll be honest with you, but neither of them are really willing to give up the information that they have. And so at the end of the scene, Spade gets really mad and says, fine, if you're not going to tell me that I'm going to kill you, I'll be back later. And if you haven't told me by then, I will kill you. And then, of course, he comes and he tells him. But then, once again, that just kind of is a big setup because they drug him and he's knocked out in the apartment for a while. Even though he tells him the whole history of the bird and everything, it kind of goes to this little message that the truth is priceless, but at the same time, it's also it could be very dangerous to a certain people, or maybe it won't be at all. It might even, the truth in this situation is going to be the undoing of absolutely everything that all of these people are striving for, but they don't know that yet.
Right, and also that the truth is a matter of ethics as well.
Right.
It seems that Gutman has really bought into this legend. He's bought into almost a fairy tale, and he's willing to do just about anything to make that, fantasy come true. And you see, even in the end, he's like, okay, well, I should have known this was fake all along. Off to Istanbul. That's where it must be next. It's always like one thing after the other. And so I think that also brings into play this idea of, fantasy versus realism, where O'Shaughnessy proposes to Spade this fantasy where it's like, yeah, we've committed all this crime, but we could still, I was hoping my love would be enough for you. Well,
right.
What a romantic idea. And I would say this movie is, extremely anti-romanticism, where instead of going off with this, romantic ideal of this great fantasy, Spade brings the truth back here at the very end. And he said, he gives it to her harsh. It is just,
yeah, he does.
It's like cold, but then at the same time, it's also warranted and necessary because she has done some extremely terrible things involving at least double homicide and who knows what else. So, he's saying, well, tough break, sweetheart. Hopefully they'll give you 20 years and sing, and I'll see you then. And I was kind of gasping at the end, but then I was like, you know what? Nope, that's the right thing to do. You can buy into this fantasy that'll essentially destroy your life and destroy other people's lives, or you can bring in this matter of the, truth, this ethics. And I think that's a great discussion that this movie plays out. We see it played out. Situational ethics, even more so, I guess, to be more specific. Depending on the situation, and I'm not going to cut Sam a complete break here, because there's a scene when we learned out her name is actually O'Shaughnessy. He's like, give me all your money. And she says, I need something to live on. And he's like, well, you got like furs and jewelry. And
Right.
I'm like, man, he doesn't mind draining women of their money. And he's like, you know what? You're going to have to hawk your jewelry and furs. And at least he gives her like some small cash back. But Sam does this throughout the movie. And it just kisses O'Shaughnessy. So at the same time, they're kind of playing each other. But in the end, it's like, who's going to make the right choice?
Right, and I wouldn't even say that this is both of these sides are this big downfall. We find that out with Iva, with her character, that he's kind of having, I guess maybe it doesn't explicitly say that he's having an affair, but he's
They kiss.
suspected of having an affair. Is he actually having an affair? Is that like for real, for real?
I think it is, because
Okay.
we do see them kiss like right away as soon as they're together. And he basically was saying, keep her away from here. Like we need to kind of lie low, but they get wrapped up in it too much. It sounds like he wants to break it off. And she drops a line that she said, did you kill Miles? And he's like, why would I do that? And she said, well, you told me if it wasn't for Miles, and then he cuts it off.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. I guess what I was insinuating is that we never really, other than them kissing and having this conversation, that's really about it. But either way, that just kind of goes even more to the fact of the point I'm trying to make is that he's very drawn towards women, towards sexual desire, and he's also drawn towards greed and the money that could be paid by both O'Shaughnessy and then again by Gutman. And I would even say that he kind of plays more into that part of it in terms of the greed, because he kind of takes her money and then he's only doing this thing for Gutman because he's going to get money out of it. The whole conversation that happens in his apartment there at the end is because he's thinking he's going to get money out of this whole deal. Once again, may not be ethically correct, but he does get cash out of it. That's how he gets paid for his jobs. And this is, to him, just another job almost. But he comes around and says, no, probably that's a bad idea. And then eventually turns everybody in and gives the police the whole story. So we do see him being thrashed around in this world where he could have both money or sex or none of it at all and give the truth and be ethically correct in the situation. And that's kind of where his character stands, as he's been battling between these three different views. And
we notice he does give that remaining money back to the detectives as proof that he was tried to be bribed. And I did find it interesting how the money, it's talked about a lot in this movie, and especially in high figures that back then, I guess if you translate it into today's money, would be $10,000 back then would have been way more today.
Oh, yeah.
And it's interesting because first Spade gets like $200. I'm like, wow, that's quite a bit. But then he is offered $5,000 by Cairo. And then he meets with Gutman, who offers him $25,000 at minimum. But then he makes this immediate leap to $1 million all of a sudden. And then he said worth many millions. And I'm like, okay, Gutman is clearly engaging in hyperbole. This is his own greedy fantasy of how much he thinks it would be worth. And he would lie to him to satiate Spade's appetite for money as well. So I think that kind of also goes to show you Gutman's fantasy of, and then we kind of get the realism of it towards the end when he only gives him $10,000. And Spade says, we were talking about a lot more money here. And he said, well, this is like all I could raise, and I'll give you more money once I get the Falcon, which is, of course, a lie, because he doesn't even let him keep the money he already gave when he finds it's not real. Something else I wanted to note about a character that we never see is we get so much talk about Thursby, but we never see him. And
that's very true. It's very true, because there are a couple, especially in this opening, is when his name is kind of thrown around a lot because he's doing things in this opening. And we hear that he's shot 4 times with a 44 or 45, but we never see the body. We do get to see Miles's body there at the opening, but it wasn't long after that we hear that Thornsby also died. But we never get to see his body. He's kind of this I guess this guy who's out there somewhere. He's never really he never shows up. He's just a part of the story, but always outside of what we're seeing.
Yeah, and in a way, all these stories that they tell of how these people met and came together kind of makes me think of the Joker in The Dark Knight, how he never tells the same story of his happening. And it's kind of interesting because in a way this movie is very postmodern, where nobody is a good guy per se until we do get it very clearly there at the very end. But the entirety of the movie, a lot of postmodernism of very good guys such as Sam will do bad things in order to achieve a good end, it seems like. Just like in The Dark Knight, Batman essentially spies on everybody, just breaks the Constitution, the Fourth Amendment, the right to privacy, in order to save the city. And that's a very postmodern idea of, I'm a good guy doing the wrong thing for a good end. And I think we see that a lot here with Spade, where he seems to want to do the right thing, but he's okay with doing bad things in order to figure that out. Right. But I wanted to mention something about Thursby here. We get details about Thursby between Spade and O'Shaughnessy talking, and she says Thursby would cover his floor around his bed in newspaper so no one could sneak up on him. I have always remembered that line ever since I first saw this movie, well over a decade ago. And I always remembered it and I never forgot it. And I thought this was such an intriguing character detail that adds a great deal to our understanding of the paranoia of this Thursby that we've never seen before. And I thought most movies don't do that. They don't take the time to give you some odd character detail about this man, especially one that's already died per se, who doesn't really have any bearing on the rest of the movie, except to know he was originally a part of this crew and then he was murdered. But I think that just goes to show you how great the writing is in this movie, that they could think up, what if Thursby was so paranoid that people were following him that he would use newspaper so nobody could sneak up on him in the night, but nevertheless he wasn't murdered in his bedroom. He was murdered like pretty much right in front of a hotel, or at least kind of by some waterfront in a way.
Right, and I would even say that is also some foreshadowing to what happens later with Miss Wonderly, because we know that they have some kind of history together. We find out they were partners in this whole situation. And then when he died, she was put even more on edge because she was a part of that whole situation. She wanted to kind of get rid of him, but at the same time, because she also wanted the bird for herself, but at the same time, they worked together. And so it is, once again, as long as adding to what you were saying, he was more, I see him as also being this more foreshadowing element to what's going to happen in the end with Miss O'Shaughnessy, because they work together, and the whole thing of him being super paranoid and putting newspapers around his bed and all sorts of things that they give this really detailed account of him but never show him. And then when we see the end of it, it's almost as if maybe he didn't exist. It is at the very end of the movie, it's almost as if her entire front was a complete lie since the beginning of the movie.
Yeah, so kind of like how Thursby would put up precautions in order for him not to get caught. She put up more so, she used lying. She used, it's not tangential like a newspaper would be. It is more so figurative instead of literal. Right. Yeah, she did. She created a series of lies in order to keep herself from being caught. She did a great job, but Sam always sees through them. I'm wondering maybe that could be a bit of a character flaw, that Sam always sees through them. I'm trying to think of a time where he isn't duped by someone. He seems to always be on to everyone.
I would say that being an investigator, he never really takes what people would say to him at face value. He's always questioning why this is. So in his mind, he may not know the answer, but he knows that something just isn't right with this entire situation. And so that's why when he finds out all this information, it's not like too big of a surprise to him, because he knew that something wasn't right with this entire situation. And mainly Miss O'Shaughnessy, he knew from the very beginning that she was lying to him, that she was making things up on the spot. That's kind of what I'm getting it as, is that just being an investigator, he already kind of just defaultly knew that somebody's not telling the truth. Maybe it's everybody, but he's not going to accept things at face value.
And this movie doesn't really give you much time to breathe.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Got probably some of the tightest pacing I've ever seen. For the most part, I do want to say that I think there is this fairly unnecessary subplot of these detectives that keep showing up, and there's one scene in particular where it's Archer's widow. She sends the detectives up there because she was jealous, and I'm just thinking, this is kind of needless. I really don't think it's contributing much to it. I guess the detectives are necessary because they are necessary there for the very end. But here, probably I'd say in the first half of the movie, aside from when he first encounters them, we just have this whole scene where they have to bust into the apartment because O'Shaughnessy and Cairo are like fighting each other or something.
Right.
I don't know. How did you feel about that?
I do see what you're getting at, but I think the scene that made it not necessarily a problem in my mind is, I think about middle towards the end there, he goes to one of the offices and talks to the guy. I think it was one of the chief officers there. But essentially the man says to him, I'm legally bound 8 hours a day, 7 days a week to tell the truth. And more or less the scene plays out, and the idea is brought up that he knows the truth as far as we're concerned. He knows the truth. But the problem here is that they don't believe that he knows the truth. They don't even believe him himself. But they are very skeptical of what he has to say. And so they're wanting to go after him for the things that may or may not even have anything to do with the rest of the case. But that's the whole point, is that he holds the truth to this entire situation. They're kind of left in the blind. And they're wanting to reprimand him for things that they believe he's done, whether or not that actually accounts for what's going on in the rest of the movie. That's the whole point. They're questioning his truth and not necessarily believing what he has to say, even though what he has to say is the right thing. That's what I was getting out of it. Is the reason why these investigators kept showing up is because they didn't really believe what he had to say, and that there was evidence stacked against him. Then he's investigating this case that they're thinking, okay, maybe he's a part of this case, and aren't believing what he has to say, even though what he is saying is truthful. Now, the whole thing with Iva coming in and being the one who called the investigators over, I can see why that would be a bit of a concern, because it is an interesting scene to come about, but at the same time, I'm pretty sure she knows that Miss O'Shaughnessy is with them, and that's kind of where I'm getting is the whole jealousy thing is coming about.
Yes, she is jealous. She is apparently, we see a shot of her watching his apartment. That seems kind of excessive. And then she calls those two detectives explicitly somehow and sends them up there. That whole scene felt a little contrived and almost a little forced, of how it's like, oh, how did you get here? Oh, well, the widow of your detective who was just murdered, who you're having an affair with, she is jealous because you saw her with another woman. Therefore, she sent us up here. And that is how. And then, we had to come in and break up this fight or something. And it was like, well, for a movie that has great dialogue, more so great pacing, this is the one time where it just all felt like it was a little contrived and forced.
Right. I would even say that this scene just kind of goes to prove for the investigators that he is getting involved with some kind of situation, and that just makes him all the more skeptical. How they got up there is a different story. But at least with this scene, the idea that it's getting across, I think, works very well for the movie. But getting there maybe is a bit muddy.
I do want to know your thoughts on the score for this movie, because mostly scores for older movies, they have a tendency to sound quite similar with their orchestral pieces. There's not a whole lot of diversity in them, not like you would here today. There is some kind of, I would say, fanciful elements to certain parts of it, but then there's also the classic, darker elements where, the dun 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 parts, and that's not explicitly how it sounds. But lots of strings usually. It seems like, at least that's what I noticed. And I would say scores didn't really come into their own until the late 60s, maybe even 70s. And I would say listen to early John Williams and see how he's evolved, especially once he did Star Wars in 77.
Right. I would say the score here is fine. It's definitely dated. That just kind of goes with the movie itself. But I would say it's not that it's not utilized well, because the score pipes up in moments that it needs to pipe up in, like when he's very suspicious or when there's a plot twist, which there are many in this movie. It kind of comes into play and kind of, once again, just kind of heightens the tension in the scene. I think it does a really good job at what it does, but in terms of maybe being iconic or maybe being, I guess the best word is having a lasting impact, it is a bit dated. I will say that much. And so in that sense, although it may not be a fault of the movie at the time, it is kind of something that happens just over time, is that the score itself, although fine, is a bit dated.
I also found there to be some comedic elements. It wasn't necessarily being written as a comedy, but just their interactions. There's a point where O'Shaughnessy or Spade says, "You're a liar." And O'Shaughnessy says, "I am. I've always been a liar." And Spade says, "Well, don't brag about it."
Yeah.
Just great dialogue like that where, I mean, it's kind of funny.
Or that time when the two investigators come to his house while Cairo and Miss O'Shaughnessy are there.
Yeah.
And they're about to leave, and then the skirmish happens in the back room, and then they're like, "I guess we better go in." He goes, "Yeah, I guess you better," and they just run inside. There's a lot of funny lines in this movie.
There is.
Yeah, there was also one line that reminded me of the Big Sleep, when he says something along the lines of collecting guns, and then in the Big Sleep he says essentially all these guys are coming into the room and he's gathering guns for these guys, and he says, "Well, while I'm gathering guns," and then goes off to do other things. It's really funny to have that callback. I don't know if it was meant to be a callback to either one of those movies, but it reminded me of that movie at that point.
Yeah. A lot of the dialogue you don't, just even some of the phrases you don't hear even today in the modern vernacular.
Yeah.
But I do like it because it shows just how it's indicative of the time when this was written, how people talked, I guess, because I'm like, wow, a lot of this, people don't say this kind of stuff anymore. I wrote down a lot of lines. I won't just read them all here. I suggest you hear them for yourself in the movie. The one that I just have in front of me right now, though, is when he's yelling at Gutman, and he's like, "You're either in or you're out for keeps." Just for keeps.
Right.
I mean, I don't know, just different things. I've got better examples in here, but...
Right. I know that one big example for me would probably be when the investigators first come to his room.
Yeah.
Not long after the entire Miles thing happens, he kind of gets up in their face and talks about mentions something about being in the Foxy. The dialogue here at times is kind of just akin to the times when this movie came out back in the 40s.
Yeah. So I guess I was a little surprised that once we come to find out that Gutman, Wilbur, and Cairo are working together, are we to assume they lured Sam here to promise him money, although they weren't really going to give him money because they drugged him, so he would just essentially be out of the way so they could go get the Falcon?
More or less.
I guess that seemed a little odd to me because I don't think Sam would know necessarily that the ship was coming unless he's in constant contact with O'Shaughnessy. And I guess the reason she kind of needs to always be with him is for protection, because otherwise they're just going to kill her and she wants the Falcon. I guess I would say I was just a little surprised how they're setting up going to pay him. They said, "We're going to pay you, go and find this for us." And then they knocked him out just to find out the ship was on fire and there's this big, giant, usual suspects type of mess going on in this ship we learn about later.
Right. Yeah, we do know that he found out that the ship that has the bird in it is the ship coming from Hong Kong, which is arriving that day. And we do find out in an earlier scene that O'Shaughnessy was the one who found it in Hong Kong and then shipped it, and that it was going to be here around this time. But she didn't exactly know where it was. At least from what she said, she knew that Thurnsby had hid it on the boat, and come to find out, Captain Jacoby had it. Yeah, they do hire him more or less to find it, but then kind of push him out of the way so they can kind of take care of it. I think that they found out where it was, but were too late in trying to grab it for themselves, and so they set the boat on fire. Wilmer did. He set the boat on fire, but Captain Jacoby was able to make it to to his detective place after being told by a missile trying to see where to go, but after being shot a couple of times. Either way, the Falcon ends up in his possession.
There's one other scene that I felt was kind of confusing. I felt like it didn't really lead anywhere. It's when Spade is in the lobby of the Hotel Florence, which is where we know Thursby was staying, and he was kind of shot close around there. And that's when he comes face to face with Wilbur for the first time, and they have this little exchange. And right. I think he calls like the hotel manager over there or something and says, "You've got this guy in your lobby who's got his guns like bulging out of his pockets," and they tell him to get lost. And then I don't know, I just don't think we go anywhere from there with like the Hotel Florence scene after that. We just kind of shift gears back to the main narrative or something.
Well, okay, so that scene, he was waiting, Wilmer, from what I understand, was waiting for Cairo to show up. And then he's shoved off by our main character, Spade. And then Cairo shows up. But we find out that from what Cairo said, he was at the police station. But in reality, he was not at the police station. He was doing something completely different, which is why he was so out of breath. So the whole point of him going there was to get information out of Cairo as to where he could find the Falcon or whatever he was there for. And Wilmer was there to grab him, to grab Cairo, I guess to shove him upstairs so he can talk to Gutman and spill the information or whatever. I don't know. Either way, nothing ever comes out of this scene because both characters are trying to do something, but nothing comes of it because one is thrown out and then the other lies and goes to sleep.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'm glad you agree with me, and that does clear it up a bit. I guess what mostly confused me was he seemed to bring the hotel manager in on it. He had asked for him even before he saw Wilbur, it seems like, and so he comes out, and then it doesn't seem much came of it. And yeah, we also, like you said, what's his name? Cairo. He was supposedly at the police station, but he actually wasn't. We do get this quite a bit in this movie, where instead of showing where these characters really were, they explain where they were, but then they technically weren't really there. And I think that can be a little confusing also, where they explain it, but then it's technically not true. Right. You just either have to listen extremely well, or this movie has so much lying in it, it just is a little hard to follow sometimes.
Right, and that could go depending on depending on who's watching it. It could go either way. Either it's a good thing or a bad thing. Because I personally see it as more of a good thing because this movie is purposefully doing this to help get across its message of lying will get you nowhere, more or less, or you should do the right thing. Whatever it is, it's going towards the whole message of the movie rather than taking away from it, because things are very confusing, but on a very purposeful and deliberate level. Somebody else may see this and go, I just can't follow with this because it is so confusing. But I would even say that that's just the whole point of the movie, is that it is confusing on purpose because that is the reason.
I think most modern audiences probably won't like this movie as much because of how dialogue driven it is. And honestly, I can't think of too many movies nowadays that are this dialogue heavy and this plot heavy, and honestly this character heavy, where characters are constantly lying, telling the truth, changing their mind, setting up other characters, stabbing them in the back. Come to find out they didn't stab them in the back. It was a different character. And it's extremely thick. And no, I like that too. I love the dialogue. I love the writing. It's masterfully done, honestly. That's why it was nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay. But I think now I understand that I don't want to be spoon-fed at all. I don't want to be spoon-fed. But there is this kind of interesting scene where we basically never ever get a rehash of what's going on. Like a recap of like, okay, so at this point, this is what's happening. It's like, you're either tracking with us or you're not. You might need to just restart the whole movie, is what it kind of seems like. But it's an interesting scene where I don't know why they necessarily put it in there. I mean, I guess I understand. But it's where we get a fade in of his secretary, Effie. I don't know if she giving like Sam a shave or something. This might be right before Captain Jacoby comes into the room, and Sam says, "And that's the story so far." And then Jacoby comes in, and I was like, "Well, giving me some slight details just to make sure I'm straight with what he thinks is going on." I don't know. What you might not feel that way at all.
Yeah, not necessarily. I guess they kind of give things away there at the end, and I would even go as far as to say that what he does give away is the real truth, and that we don't get the real truth until everything else is set up, because I think it would be even more confusing to get us up to speed, but then backtrack and then restart again in this later scene about 20-ish minutes later after we get Captain Jacoby coming in. I think it'll be just a bit too confusing to have two different stories so close to one another, instead of just having the whole movie us trying to track just to keep track of where we're at and whose story is whose and where we're at in the whole story, what's the real truth, what's really happening here, and then explain it all at the end, then have moments where there's, I guess, checkpoints more or less.
But could we agree that here in the third act is probably when it gets the most dense?
Oh, yeah. This is when things get extremely confusing, because now it's not just you're tracking with one person at a time like you were in the previous hour and 20 minutes. Now you're tracking with everybody at the same time. And I would say, luckily, Humphrey Bogart's character, Spade, does a pretty good job at keeping things organized as much as he can. This movie, at least at this point, gets extremely confusing. I wouldn't be surprised if you don't get it after your first and second, maybe even second viewing.
There is a part here towards the end where Sam is called away by O'Shaughnessy because she is in trouble. She needs his help. So he gets in a cab and drives to a vacant lot. And the reason I bring this up is because this is probably the second part of the movie. The first part was Thursby with the newspapers that I always remembered. This part I actually always remembered as well, because I felt like there was always something very sinister about her lying to him in such a way after she has proven herself to be a liar, but she seems to be on his side. And then all of a sudden she says, "Come to this vacant lot." And when I first saw this movie when I was younger, I was like, oh my gosh, is he gonna are they gonna run out of the woods and attack him or something? Is he just gonna get jumped and murdered here all of a sudden? There just always seemed to be something very sinister about her faking the attack. Like, that whole conversation was a lie. Screaming and everything, because we know at that point they had already convinced her to tell him to essentially go away so they could come back and search his office. And but that's another great part of the writing, is this red herring. Right. It goes to show that her character, and then later she's like, well, they made me do it, but then there's other things they didn't make her do.
Right. Yeah, this is one thing I actually really enjoyed too, that I was a bit confused on the first viewing, because I thought for a minute he was going to his office, and then he goes to some random place in this random empty lot. I was like, what's going on here? I understood it the second time around, because she sent him there. That's where she was, apparently, just to get him away from his office so that they could go in and try and find the Falcon, which isn't there. It's in a lockbox somewhere else, which, once again, Humphrey Bogart was just smart enough just to know that. That's one thing I really, really enjoy, and this is when the entire climax more or less happens, is right here in this room. Everything is explained, everybody's story comes together to find the real truth as to what exactly is going on with this bird, and why they're all here, how they got here, all this stuff. But to get there is really confusing. Okay, so from what I understand, the truth here is that, so Thurnsby and O'Shaughnessy came here. No, they found the Falcon in Hong Kong, I believe. It was in Istanbul. They got it to Hong Kong and shipped it here. And upon doing so, when they both arrived here, Thurnsby was going to backstab our girl, and so she went to Spade, and she paid Spade to track, or I guess at this point it was Archer, paid Archer to track down and watch Thurnsby. Well, at the time, she thought she shot Thurnsby as what what Spade had said, there's no way he could have gotten shot by somebody he was looking out for, which means that he kind of put the pieces together. She's the one who shot him. She shot him because I believe she had shot... No. Thurnsby was already dead at this point. And so she shot him because she didn't want to be a suspect of the rest of the case. So then after that, the whole investigation begins, and then she starts making up lies to keep her track record straight. So in her story, she killed Miles and Wilmer killed Thurnsby. Well, the bird hadn't gotten there yet. It was still on the boat from Hong Kong. And so when it arrived, she knew where it was at to a certain extent, but had given Captain Jacoby of the ship, specific instructions as to what to do with the bird. I think Thursby did. Was what to do with the bird when it arrived. Well, when it arrived, the only thing that they knew, that being Gutman and Cairo and Wilmer, as long as they knew, is that it was on the boat. They just didn't know where. So they searched the boat, and then Wilmer caught the boat on fire. Luckily, Jacoby ran off, but was shot a few times. In doing so, Wilmer shot him because he had the bird. He meets up with O'Shaughnessy, who tells him, actually I think she told him earlier, to go to Spade and give him the bird. Upon doing so, he dies in the office, giving him the bird and the instructions. So he takes the bird, Spade does, and gives it and puts it in the lockbox. And then at the same time, Gutman and Cairo and Wilmer had all heard about this whole skirmish, and they had moved. They came here, and they, I think they came from Istanbul. We do know that Cairo and Miss O'Shaughnessy worked together or had an ordeal in Istanbul where they found the bird. Well, upon doing so, they find the bird, they get the bird there, the whole thing happens here, and then they find out that it's fake. So as far as I'm aware, that's the story as to how every character got to where we are at the very end here.
Yes, more or less that is correct. The movie doesn't give us too explicit of details on O'Shaughnessy and Cairo's background and history, and even Gutman. I think it alludes to that they were all kind of working together at one point or the other, but Thursby and O'Shaughnessy said, let's essentially take it for ourselves and kind of hide it away and run away together, and they knew they were going to ship it from Hong Kong to San Francisco, which would have taken a long time. Hence, that's why they were ahead of the boat. And then Cairo and Gutman, and Wilbur he's just the gunman, essentially. Gutman kind of calls him a son, but he said sons are replaceable. He's like, you can always have another son, technically. And so that's how they all kind of came together, and Spade was more or less dragged into the situation because of this lady. She basically said, kind of helped protect me in a way, but that was, she was always doing it for her own benefit, and it wasn't more or less for protection. It was in a way, but it was also to keep an eye on Thursby when the Falcon would come. But essentially, she just decided to shoot him, and then there's no way she could let Archer stay alive, or else then that would have given her away right away, and we wouldn't have had the rest of the plot. So she shot him. I thought it was a great twist. I was surprised, actually.
Right. There are a multitude of twists in this movie, and some of them are actually kind of false, because they're twists that aren't exactly true when you get way down to it. But you are very right. This twist at the very end, you finally figure things out after so long of being so confused as to who's doing what, who's telling the truth, where is this all coming from. Finally, we get the truth. But even now, we have to trek through so much dialogue and so many different stories and piece together everything from 50 different accounts that it is hard, I would say, to get through because it is so dense. There are so many things, so many factors going into this truth here, this story, that have been convoluted and stretched and mangled. That finally we have Spade, who explains it all to us, but it takes a great deal of cognition to get through that.
Right, and it's not necessarily that he is even explaining it to us. I think they do a good job of depicting him figuring it out for himself.
Yeah.
Therefore, we're figuring it out as well. And at first I was confused, how did he know it was her? But I believe he just process of elimination.
Yeah, I mean, he even says that he was suspicious from the very beginning, and yeah, process of elimination. He just eventually worked it down and figured it out. Partly because she never really told him the truth, partly because he was always suspicious of her from the very beginning whenever they met.
Yeah. Well, okay, the police show up. I didn't hear him on the phone tell the police to come to his apartment. Did he say that?
Yeah, he had mentioned it. He said, watch out for these guys. And then I think he also had evidence for them as well. And that's when he gave over O'Shaughnessy.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
I guess I was so focused on him handing her over, and I was like, oh, are they there for her? Because that's almost what it leads you to believe. I was like, but he didn't say that on the phone. But yeah, I guess him saying, I've got some evidence for you would make more sense why they came there.
Right.
The situation.
And this is one thing I also like about the scene too, is that when they find out that the bird is fake, everyone just instinctively begins blaming everybody else. To them, it is not their fault that the bird is fake, and they just begin blaming everybody else until Gutman comes up and says, maybe the real bird is still in Istanbul and gets Cairo and Wilmer. Well, I guess at this point, Wilmer's run off. But him and Gutman and Cairo decide that they're going to go to Istanbul, and they run out trying to find this. I guess we can assume at this point the bird was never real in the first place. Maybe as far as we're concerned, the whole history of the bird isn't even real at all. In fact, it was just a hunk of lead from the very beginning that may not even made it past whatever the story was saying, and that someone just created a story for it, and that kind of garnered a legacy. We never find the real bird.
Yeah, we never find it, and more or less, it's been 400 years since its creation, so it's essentially a legend at this point.
Right.
And I think that goes to the overall theme of just this elusive greed. If you're not satisfied by what you've already got, and it's just kind of talking to the constant hunger of humanity for materialism, or I guess possibly even consumerism more and more. It's like, once I find this, then I'll be happy. But I highly doubt that, because nothing in their character would insinuate such a thing. So those two character types are set up and contrasted very well, where it seems like Sam is a greedy person also. He's always like, give me money, and you're going to have to huck your jewelry, lady. I'm sorry, but I need this. But ultimately, in the end, he, and I'm sure through those circumstances, because there's a really great scene right there. I think it's great, where Gutman is just ripping open the package with such fervor. The expression on his face is great, how he just can't wait to get it and can't wait to see if it's real, and everybody's face is just so drawn to the situation. And then you notice, instead of Spade watching the package get open to see if it's the real thing, he's watching Gutman. And he sees Gutman's just unsatiable greed being played out. And I think that was a really great scene.
Right, and I love the image, because at this point, I think this is when the music for me is done probably the best in the whole movie. You get to see the bird for the first time, and you get to see how Gutman kind of carefully takes it and then sits it up on the table and removes all the packaging around it, so they can just kind of look at it as more of an idol, more or less, that this is what's going to make us rich in the end. And then not long after that, they find out it's fake. But it is a really powerful scene, because the music pipes in, and then you see him slowly kind of prop up this idol, more or less, to them, of, I guess, success, or for them, it's just all of their problems are now gone, because they have the thing that's going to give them all the money to get them anything that they could ever want, until they find out that it's fake. And it's a really, really well done moment, probably one of the best in history, because of course the whole thing's been building up to this moment, only to find out that, along with almost everything else in this movie, it's fake.
Right. And I think Cairo himself is a bit of a fraud. He thinks of himself more than what he really is, because he says, well, the rightful owner, I guess, technically was the King of Spain, because that's who it was made for. But it should be mine. And so he's kind of setting himself up on the level with the King of Spain.
Right.
Instead of finding it for the purposes of putting it in a museum, like Indiana Jones would do, it's kind of more akin to those bad guys who wanted for power, wealth, prestige, you name it, essentially. So honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if Spielberg and Lucas got some ideas from this Best Picture nominee, Maltese Falcon.
Oh, I'm sure that they did at some point. There are some similar ideas here.
Yeah, there is. And of course, the final line, I had completely forgotten it, but it is very famous.
Mm-hmm.
When they say, "What is this?" and he says, "The stuff dreams are made of." So famous, credits roll. Wow, amazing.
Right. And I love this image too, where Miss O'Shaughnessy is in this elevator and the elevator door closes. I guess the gate closes. And you see how part of the gate and the shadow of the gate is like covering part of her eye. And that's when he says a line. And then he takes the Falcon and then walks down the stairs with it while she's taking the elevator. And really, really famous moment here in this movie with this imagery. And then, of course, the stuff that dreams are made of, that kind of a thing.
And I guess you could almost even read into it and say they're seeking this uncaged bird, and that is their cage. They've created their own bird cage, essentially. They've imprisoned themselves in this greedy hunt for this elusive artifact, and instead of like just kind of having the freedom to just walk away and be okay with it being a fake like Sam does, we literally see O'Shaughnessy put in a cage.
Yeah.
There at the very end.
And that's why...
Great symbolism.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I was thinking that maybe the bird just in general doesn't exist at all the way that they think it is. They could, as far as we know, I guess in some sense it really doesn't matter. Because the whole point of the story is that the bird was fake. And so maybe them playing up the fact that, perhaps in Istanbul, the bird actually exists there. It doesn't exactly matter because the bird is fake in this instance. And that's the whole point, is that maybe, as far as we know, the bird never existed in the first place. And it was just some kind of legend. And then someone made the bird out of a legend. Or maybe the bird did exist and the accounts were hyperbolized to have it being encrusted with jewels and painted black or whatever. Whatever the reason is, the point is the bird was fake from the very beginning. The lie didn't get them anywhere but a hunk of lead.
We didn't say much about Peter Lorre's character, Cairo. Peter Lorre is a very famous actor, and I really always enjoyed his character. I've always thought Cairo was a cool name.
Yeah, it really is, and I love how kind of a sleazeball he is in this movie.
Yeah.
He seems very sophisticated. He's kind of like Gutman, where they're both quite expensive, at least in their outward appearance. But when you really look inside, they're really greedy, and they're kind of really slimy. And I do know that his character in the book was homosexual, and they kind of give off that vibe in this movie, but it isn't outwardly expressed I guess not explicitly expressed here. It's just kind of hinted at moments. One of the big things that I read was when he puts his can up to his mouth there in the office when he talks to Spade, the perfume that he has on that Effie comes in and brings it to him, and before he lets him in, they give off subtle hints, but of course they never outwardly express it. At the time, that would have been kind of a big no-no.
Yeah, it's not too. They don't really hit that subject home. There's possibly little hints right there.
Yeah,
but I've seen Peter Lorre in a few movies. I've always enjoyed his performances. I don't think this is one of his best performances because he's more of a supporting character that he does have to compete with Bogart and Greenstreet. And or Sydney Greenstreet is who I meant to say, and whatever that lady's name is, I completely forgot. O'Shaughnessy, I don't remember her name in real life. I forgot what her name was, but they're also great, and he doesn't have that much screen time, so he's kind of relegated to the background. Right. One of his most famous movies is M. Oh
yeah, I mean I haven't seen it, but I know of it.
Yes, it's a dark movie. So he's very famous, and listeners, I know even if you haven't seen this movie, you can't picture what Peter Lorre looks like. If you look up a picture, I'm sure you will have seen him at least once before. His voice is pretty famous also, and his voice has been caricatured many times over. He usually is some Igor type creepy, yes, master type voice. Peter Lorre is quite famous, so it is. I always enjoyed him though as Cairo in this character, mostly because I think he's pretty funny. How there's a great scene where he sticks him up in his office. He says, "I'm gonna search it," and then he just punches him, and then he's like, "Okay, I'm sorry. Will you give me my gun back?" Yeah. And then he just pulls it back on him again. And then Bogart just laughs and like keeps his hands up and he's like, "Be my guest, search around." Right. And then he punches him again in his own apartment. And he says, "That is the second time you have laid hands on me, sir." And Bogart says, "When you're slapped, you're going to take it and you're going to like it."
Yeah. I just like this because both Wilmer and Cairo are kind of just beat around in this movie. Yes. And it's funny because Wilmer is supposed to be the guy who's the protection of these two men. Yep. He's always watching Spade. He's always has a gun pointed at Spade. But Spade, 3 or 4 times the movie, kind of gets the jump on him and takes his guns away from him, saying that he really doesn't have much power beyond the weapon that he possesses in his hand. It's a really funny thing that this movie brings up. Maybe this is maybe I know you've seen more Bogart than I have. Is it a common trope to have Bogart just kind of take guns away from people?
Yeah, Bogart is usually the guy who's in charge. He's always the commanding presence on screen where if you're not going his way, then he's either going to shut you down, shut you out, or, pop one off in the face. Okay. That is classic Bogart.
Okay. I know that you've seen more Bogart than I have, so that's why I asked.
Yes.
But from the 2 movies that I've seen, I guess technically 3, Casablanca doesn't necessarily count in this example. But from The Big Sleep in this one, he's always constantly taking guns away from people. And I was wondering if that was just a common trope or if it was just a thing for a few movies.
Yeah, I think in the further reviews, you will see he does wield guns frequently. But even when he doesn't wield guns, he's usually always wielding some kind of power.
Okay. Makes sense.
Yeah, and I know, I think Wilmer is a nice side character as well. They set him up for the fall guy, which I found to be kind of a funny scene as well. It's kind of dark humor because they're like, "There's your fall guy right there. That's him." Yeah. Nope, that's him. Just set him up. And we see Wilmer escapes, and I know in the end of the book, Wilmer shoots Greenstreet.
Okay.
And I definitely could have seen it going this way into this movie because that wouldn't be uncommon for everybody to get like shot at the end and have this kind of, fade out scene of like, "Oh, this is what happens when you do bad things." But I'm glad they didn't go that way. They just leave that up to us. Wilmer and Greenstreet are going to either get caught or have some kind of gunfight eventually. I think they ended it very appropriately.
Yeah, and I would even say, maybe this isn't, I'm not going to say this is definitive, but I would say a theory is maybe the whole reason for Wilmer's character to be there is more of a warning sign of what Spade could become if he joins these guys. Because really, Wilmer's only there because of the money. He never really does anything else. He hardly says a word. He's kind of just protection. I guess everyone's there for money, but he's very weak in terms of a physical build, and he's always constantly being overpowered, him and Cairo. So I wonder if it's more of just a warning sign of what Spade will become if he joins these guys for their money.
I think it goes to show that the people under Sidney Greenstreet are expendable.
Yeah.
No, Gutman just uses everybody under his control is expendable. That's why he basically throws Wilmer under the bus, and he says, in a very Darth Vader-esque way, "Would you like to join me? And I really like you. You're smart, and together we'll get the Falcon." And I don't know what they would even do with it. I guess just be rich. But
yeah, that's basically it.
Yeah. Once again, I guess I wouldn't be I know Star Wars draws from a lot of archetypes, but this does, now that you mention it, feel very similar to how Gutman's character feels very similar to the Emperor, how he is always looking for somebody new and he's always using them in order to do that. And we see that with Wilmer and Spade being more skilled that way. So who knows? I'm sure. Yeah. I have no doubt George Lucas knows of this movie. He watched it and maybe drew some ideas from it, drew some inspiration. Very likely.
Right.
So, Alan, what is your rating and recommendation for the Maltese Falcon?
Now, the Maltese Falcon may be very confusing, very muddy, hard to trek through because there is so much information that doesn't matter in this movie, or is so much information that, I guess not, it doesn't matter, but is not true to the overall, to what is really going on here, that it could push some people away from experiencing this movie. That's where I would say that this movie absolutely excels in. For something that is normally a criticism, especially in more modern movies, with certain plot elements more or less just kind of there for really no reason, this movie uses that, and I would even say abuses that rule of taking plot points that shouldn't be there, but using them in a very smart way. Because in this movie, there are so many plot points that really aren't true, but that's the whole point. They're not true because of the message that's going with this movie. You need those red herrings all over the place in this movie just to get the truth out. And even then, it takes a long time and a lot of dialogue to get through to find out what exactly is the real truth here. And in the very end, the girl who's made up as many lies, the girl who's made up the most lies of anybody else in this movie, who's been trying to get out of this movie since the very beginning, ends up being the fall guy at the very end. This is of course, no wonder this is a very influential and very popular, cited as one of the best movies ever made. No wonder it was put into the film registry in 1989. This is a fantastic movie, and although it's definitely has some age showing against it, in terms of a couple of things that we've mentioned in this podcast, I would say that it is still one that is extremely important when it comes to cinema. And so with this, I'm going to have to give it a 10 out of 10, highest of highest recommends. It's an absolute must-see.
The Maltese Falcon is not only a great film, noir, but it is just a great film in general, mostly due to the exceedingly well-written dialogue and how the characters, how the actors bring that to their character and how that dialogue comes out. In the hands of lesser actors, this would have easily gone south and gone bad, and I don't think it would have been as well-renowned as it is today. Even at the time when it came out, it was very well critically praised, and it still is as well. And that's why when people think of Humphrey Bogart, this, Casablanca, Treasure of the Sierra Madre, those are just three of them that people are like, oh yeah, those are the top three, at least when The African Queen's another one, when Bogart comes to mind. And that makes sense because Bogart exhibits a fairly diverse range of acting here, between kind of being very tricky. He is an opportunist. He is a good guy. But then at the same time, he has some very unethical elements as well. So he has a very deep, complex character here, and he's surrounded by a wonderful cast that exhibits that as well. Coming back watching this with my SSG goggles, I am extremely impressed with how this movie crafts a narrative that has all of these twists and red herrings, but even though they're a lie, they still pay off and they still pay into the overall message and the overall narrative. And none of them are pointless. I did say I did had that one issue with the side plot of him and the widow constantly kind of getting together. Probably in like the first act of the movie, I just was kind of missing how we really needed this to tie in with the Maltese Falcon and with the detectives. That doesn't carry on throughout the rest of the movie. That was just something in the first act I felt we could have excised to kind of make it a little more succinct. But regardless, that's not that big of a deal. It doesn't derail the movie whatsoever. But yes, nevertheless, The Maltese Falcon is a great Humphrey Bogart movie. One of his best. I'm excited to see how it stacks up against Casablanca, of course, which did go on to win Best Picture.
Right. That will be a very interesting conversation to have, comparing this one with Casablanca, because it's no secret that's considered to be one of the greatest movies ever made, just in general.
Yes, so that'll be a difficult comparison, but
yes, it will be.
Nevertheless, it'll be a fun one. I'm looking forward to it, but I am giving the Maltese Falcon 9 stars out of 10 with a very high recommend. So listeners, thank you so much for joining us on our very first Humphrey Bogart review. For our new Humphrey Bogart retrospective series, where we will be looking at the more famous films of Bogart. I believe we're only doing 4, but we will. Yes, but in the future, we might come back to the series. The year's almost over, so next year we might do 4 more or something. Not promising anything, but just saying that depending on how this retrospective goes, we might come back and review a few more. But just at the time, just to let you know, over the coming weeks, we'll be reviewing a few more Bogart films. I'm looking forward to those. Also, make sure to look for our Halloween special. We reviewed Poltergeist, a classic, cult classic as it's come to be known. So make sure to listen to that review as well. We also have a kind of a Thanksgiving type special coming up, at least kind of around there. That's the first of its kind, I believe. And at least that's what we've done. And then a Christmas special, of course, which we've done a Christmas special last year. So we're doing that again this year. Make sure to listen for those. We're keeping those under wrap at the moment, but we will reveal to you those very soon, especially as they get closer. And so make sure to sign up through social media, through your email, through whatever is your preference. That way you never miss an episode, you never miss an article. You're always up to date on the latest content from Silver Screen Guide. And if you want to help us out, if you liked this show, then go ahead and click the button in the description below to support us. For the price of a Starbucks cup of coffee, you will get our thoughts on the latest movie news, some special reviews, even some bonus podcasts, commentaries, Q&A. You'll get all of that for a very reasonable price, and that is yours to keep. A cup of coffee you drink, and it's gone. This you get to keep. So make sure to help us out. We really appreciate the support. That's how we keep the show free. So if you want the show to be free, you don't want to have to pay for every single episode, consider giving us a small donation, and that could just be a one-time donation as well. All of that is in the description below. It's pretty hard to miss, listeners, so make sure to go and check out that area. Once again, we want to say thank you so much for listening. We love talking about movies, and we love talking about them with you. So make sure to go to iTunes, leave us a 5-star review. That will help us in the rankings. That'll help us get found easier. We love discussing movies with you guys, so we want to make sure that other people have the same opportunity to join the discussion. So make sure to share it with your friends and family and just anybody you know. We really appreciate you all listening, and we'll catch you next time.